Please, people, would you like to sit down? Then I can start again. I would like to ask your attention. You all have enjoyed a nice lunch, I suppose. Thanks for the organization, for the supporters and the financial supporters. It's a good location to have lunch here. You should try it another time in private, maybe. Maybe sit on the terrace in the sunshine. But that's another season. Well, let's start again for the afternoon. And we have several interesting speakers. We've also a small surprise during the break, or before the break, in the afternoon break. And I'll tell you later about that. But we first start with the presentation of Ian Cowx. Ian Cowx, he's a professor, he's a director of the University of the Hull International Fisheries Institute. He's also involved in the reform project and projects before the reform project already, the forecaster, and before that, and before that. So he's very much involved in this matter. And in the reform project itself, he is work package 5, the leader. So I would like to give you the floor, Ian, and you can introduce yourself maybe and tell the story that we want to know. Yes?
Thank you, Wim. The only story I want to tell you, I've known Tom a very long time. A very long time. What I want to talk about today is actually parts of what have come out of Work Package 5 of reform, and it's all about defining success and linking to that, as in the programme, this benchmarking and endpoint criteria. So this is part of the process that's coming out of, I say, Work Package 5, and where we're going to go partly with Work Package 5, and I'm going to put a request in at the end of this. There's your assignment for your questions after on the right-hand side. You've got a challenge, basically. We've all got a challenge to write an essay on how making the future look bright. I'm not sure we can ever do that, but perhaps reform will help. But what I'm going to do here in this talk is briefly look at why do we restore rivers, and it's been talked about quite a bit, but I just want to set the scene a little bit. What are the issues relating to restoration success? Can you move it over that way so I can see? Okay. Determining methods of determining restoration success, and I want to specifically look at this process of project planning and linking it to benchmarks and endpoints. And then finally, the question I'm going to throw at you for future reform work is synergies between other sectors to try and improve outcomes of restoration. And I'll briefly go over that at the end. Why do we do it? We've all seen lots of pictures, so I'm going to scan through these quickly. These are typical of what you get of bank stabilisation measures, log weirs to try and create a channel heterogeneity, even throwing simple things like boulders into urban areas, and this is in the middle of Sheffield. I'll come back to this in the future, just to try and create heterogeneity. And then, this is one of your ones locally. Stole this one from Tom, one of your big floodplain restoration activities. We do a lot of this, improving connectivity, always for fish. Are fish so important? As far as I'm concerned, yes. As far as everybody else is concerned, not fish again. But they are important, and we build a lot of these, and actually you'll see how important they are in a minute. When you actually look at the occurrence of hydromorphological measures, and if you look through the river basin management plans from across Europe, this is the sort of outcome you get, and the connectivity part is down here. The proportion of activities going on, bypass ladders, fish ladders, removal of structures, weirs, connectivity is critical to what's going on, and it's where we tend to go. Is that the only solution? I'm not convinced, even though I'm a fish person. There's quite a bit of work to deal with renaturalisation, as they call it, which I think is probably closer to rehabilitation. And then there's stuff to deal with sediment management here, and then some natural retention measures, water retention measures to do with floodplains and things. And you've got this major area of water management, so flow management tools, mainly hydropeaking and ecological flows. And then finally got this massive thing called others, which incorporates everything else that we didn't know and didn't want to know quite often, what people would class as restoration, and actually in reality it often isn't. Tom's shown this slide before. This is typical of the sorts of outcomes you get from many projects. These are the Interreg and life projects, and linking to restoration. There's a whole stack of them, and we've actually reviewed what they're trying to do and trying to achieve, and that's quite an interesting outcome when you have a look at what's going on. And we did review them over 670 projects in Europe, including those 250 Interreg projects, and we also have a look at the outcomes and looked at the literature about 37,000 North American projects, and what the main outcomes of these projects, what were their main objectives. Basically, few of them had very few what we call endpoint criteria, so they had no end point. They didn't really define what they were going to do. They were mostly linked to WFD objectives, which you all know, GSGP, and some habitat directive. Because life is habitat directive driven, there were habitat improvements and things. The key point here is they're rarely quantitative. So improved GES, well, to this day, and I've been trying to work on Water Framework Directive for many years, I still don't know what GES is, I still don't know what GEP is, because people just come up with these criteria and they're different for different systems. So we need to be a bit more specific associated with it. So what we're finding is that a lot of these outcomes of these projects are pretty limited in many respects, and quite often they don't account for cost and benefits of doing activities. This is the outcome of that reporting that we've done. If you want to see this in more detail, the work package is now up on the wiki, I believe, for Reform Wiki. But this tells you some of the outcomes and what's going on, and it tells a horrible picture as far as I'm concerned. Looking at the biological, morphological and physical chemical outcomes of these projects, most of them, as you can see, this long blue line is there's no information. Lovely, isn't it? Yeah, what a great start. And then when you have a look at, was it successful? Here we go. They're up here, the top blue line. And these are mostly, yes, we hit GEP or we hit GES. Or we achieved a conservation status. So it's quite worrying what's going on. The number of failed is interesting. A couple here. Yeah. Do we never fail? I'll show you a couple of examples in a minute. And unclear. It's unclear because they never set any objectives. So there's a whole load of problems that are coming out of a lot of these projects, which we've got to start to think about and move forward. And here's a good example, and Jenny may even talk about this one. This is a great one that from where I live, up north of England. And this is a very famous project called the Rivers Kern. It's one of the very early EU life projects. And this is what it used to look like, with a bend in the river to make it look natural. And this is the city of Darlington. And they invested a lot of money to rehabilitate it, move it through the parks, and put bends back in the back eddy here. So that's the same site, effectively. What's the outcome of that? The outcome is it cost 1.1 million, so somebody made some money somewhere, and the impact was negligible, and it was negligible mainly for one purpose. Darlington Sewage Works is here, and the effluent comes through here, and the fish never recovered until they actually put a new investment in the sewage works. So there's an element of you've got to get things right first, like water quality, before you even invest this sort of money. There may have been other improvements, and socially this became a nice park for people to walk their dogs and things, but then after a while you didn't want to walk in it because there was lots of things left behind that dogs leave. Just to show that we're not just alone here in the UK, here's another example. These are the synthesis of the US restoration done by Bernard and Palmer and people, and this is the sort of activities that were put in, and as you can see, the same sorts of criteria and things we're trying to achieve, and here's the basic outcome of that. 20% of those projects, so that's over 3,000, didn't even have any goal. They just did them. And coming from the UK, let me tell you, we do that all the time. There's a bit of spare money, we go and do something. We don't think about why we do it, we just do it, because there's a little bit of cash. 10% of the projects had no form of assessment. So you're doing it, but you don't even know if there's going to be an outcome because we haven't put any investment into checking it out. So that's a huge amount of projects, which you're not designing any consequences, any outcomes. They're just going ahead and happening. And that's really quite worrying. And, you know, it's pan-European. So some of the problems that come out of this is that when people actually are doing these restoration projects, they don't set goals, but they're also... the goals they set are pretty stupid, or sorry, they're not feasible. And the reality is that if you have a look what you're trying to achieve is you've got these sorts of processes, and here's your decline in your status of your water body that you're dealing with, and then you're trying to restore it. And when you try to restore it, everything hopes it's going to go back along this trajectory, and it may go one way or whichever way. And the reality is you never go back to where you were, historically or whatever the case may be. Your deterioration is huge, and you're taking out elements of the ecosystem functioning. And we've got to be aware of that. And so what people are trying to achieve often is not technically feasible. And the example I always use is London. You cannot restore the River Thames in London. I mean, you've all probably been to London and seen it. As much as I'd like to restore it and reflood London, I don't think I'll be allowed to do it. And the reality is, people wouldn't want it anyway because you'd have large woody debris and swamps and mosquitoes and malaria. Great. I live in the north of England, by the way, as you've probably realised. The other things that you've actually got are, do we know enough about it? And people say, yes, we do. Other people say, no, we don't. So do we know enough about the distribution of our target species, the organisms we're dealing with? We're learning all the time. Do we know enough? I'm not 100% sure we do, and I'll give you an example in a second. And also, do we know what's stopping these species getting or recovering and returning to their former glory? The answer to that, again, is probably not. And here's an example. It's come from Canada, but it's one done by one of my PhD students. It's a lovely little example of showing what we're trying to do. And this is a nice brook. You can see it here. It looks quite nice, doesn't it? Actually, it was degraded for logging to get the wood out of the system and float down trees, and then the logging industry collapsed, and they wanted to restore it. So this is on the east coast of Canada. And what we did, to try and recover this, to get back brook trout, because they were the species they really didn't want to, they wanted to recover. And we wanted to get brook trout back, and there were salmon in the system. Follow me around this thing. And what we looked at is, can we get simple measures? Brook trout want pool riffle sequences, and they want sort of shelter. And so what we've tried to do is put in boulder clusters, V dams and half-log dams to look at and recreate habitat that they would like. So these are what went in. You can see lots of big boulders went in. There's a V-shaped weir here and half-log weirs to get the pool riffle systems that you want, just to create habitat for the brook trout. Here's the outcome. The brook trout, basically, this is before it went in and this is after. The brook trout with the weirs, we got some young of the year appearing, but generally the big stuff we wanted didn't. But the worst part was the salmon numbers increased, and the salmon compete. So we got the wrong outcome because we didn't know enough, I suspect. And it's quite an important issue. So we're taking risks, and there's a lot of uncertainty in what we're doing. There is also an issue about social and political override that we forget. And I was talking to somebody, I've forgotten names, apologies, just before, while you're having your debates with the various other speakers, about social and political override. You really can't do things. Just like the London example, you can't flood it because people won't like it, and nor will the politicians. And you end up with examples like this, and it is a problem. This was a lot of work that went on in flooding that went on in the UK, and this is what the river used to look like. As you can see, it's what Angela showed. This is in an urban environment, and beautiful woodland scenery with... there's a river coming down here, and there's actually one coming down here as well. We had big floods in the UK in 2007, as I think you had in the Netherlands, and Sheffield went underwater. Instant response. We've had enough of you ecologists. We've heard enough. So the land drainage people came in, and that was the end product. That's the same site. They took out all the trees on the bankside vegetation. Everything came out. And as you let rivers recover, as Angela has shown you, this is what happened. So here's the two rivers coming together. I should also point out they actually unearthed a weir, a new weir, so they had to build a fish pass, which was great. Huh? So this is the river recovering, and eventually as it's recovering with more gravel deposition, natural deposition, you can see the gravel bar coming in here, and the trees regrowing. By the way, they're just going to be taken out before this winter. But the river itself now doesn't actually go through the river, it goes through a leat and comes into this one, because the gravel build-up has been so great. So rivers do things nicely for you, but they're not far away from the same scenario, moving back to it. And what will happen, we'll get back to this, and probably next year we'll be doing the same. Ironically, when this happened, it was quite good for small salmon, small trouts. The numbers increased, but there was coarse fish here and they disappeared completely. So you get a change in what's going on. And then you get some good examples of restoration. Some of you may have seen this one before, but I love this. That's the best. And I think we can, as reformed partners, we can all go away and go home happy that that's what we should be creating. I'm saying no more. You'd like to see it again. If you'd like a copy, I can take you to see it. It's brilliant. I should also point out there's a water quality problem here. These here are Chinese restaurants, a number of them. No Chinese here, are there? And what you've actually got is the water. They used to just throw everything, the waste stuff, straight into the river. So they pumped it in all these pipes that go all the way down here, and they dump it at the bottom now. So there's no water quality problem. Oh, by the way, there's no fish either. The other thing is that many of these projects that we're dealing with are fairly localised and small scale, in small scale on small parts of river bodies. And we're talking about, Water Framework Directive, about big river restoration projects. And finally, and fundamentally, I think it's come out of what I've just been saying, is there's often no planning and there's clearly no objectives set. And this is quite a fundamental problem when you go through the literature. So what I want to do is actually explore this and show you this process that's come out of reform. It looks horrible to you. Don't panic. I'm going to go through it in sequences. This is actually the strategy that we're trying to put forward in quite what looks quite complicated, but actually it's not. It's quite simplified, and I'll work you through it. But basically, it's the project cycle linked to restoration. So you've got a planning component within the restoration cycle and development, and it goes from project identification, formulation, do it, and then monitor it. Four simple steps, effectively. And I want to sort of systematically go through it. The key point on here I want to show you this point is that there is a lot of feedback and a lot of consultation, so that people are involved and local people are engaged with what you're actually adopting. If you don't have that, you're not going to get anywhere. You'll always find somebody who'll come out of the woodwork and want to say something about it. The other thing that we need to do is we need to capture all the risks and uncertainties I've talked about. We need to also consider what's going on in what Angela, hope was going to talk about, which is different river styles. So you've got different types of rivers, and therefore you've got to adapt this process for the different types of river dealing, from large rivers here, like you've got outside the door, through to Mediterranean rivers, through to the little things we have in the UK. So we have to adapt the process, but we can produce a framework. Also, when restoration planning, recognise that it doesn't happen overnight. And that is one of the fundamental problems that politicians and managers don't like, is, well, we've invested all this money and we haven't seen a response yet. And this is 5 years down the line. Well, a salmon population will take 15, 20, 25, 3 generations of salmon. So you've got to really think about it. And we also need to account for the social ecological coupling process, that we've got to think about the social and ecological outcomes of this. And this is where you're going into ecosystem services, and that's part of this work package which Jan van Aert is actually dealing with, which obviously I haven't got time to talk about. But we need a tool for managing expectations effectively. So what we're actually looking at is driving this through the thing called the Dipsea Approach. And I should point out that it's up here, the Dipsea Approach. These yellow parts are the Dipsea Approach. This is another classic management tool, drivers, pressures, state, impact and response. And the way we've translated that is having a look at what's causing us to the problems, what's the drivers of all the various problems, and what's the drivers of actually moving forward. So these are, as you see, things like Water Framework Directive. What's the pressures? So we all understand pressures, I hope, as Water Framework Directive people, so it's all the agriculture and navigation and all those sorts of things. The state, where are we? What's the state of your river? And what's the future status? Understanding what else might be enacting on that water body, such as climate change. And then, what's the impact? Christian and Massimo and people have actually been talking a little about the impact on the biological elements and how it's declined. And then the response, the measures. Again, Massimo started to talk about this in real terms. So we're using this process to divide this sort of setup. And what it's done is broken down into a series of components. The project identification. And during this phase, what we're looking at is actually reviewing the status. So here is the status of the Dipsea. So looking at the current status of the water body, what's it in? What's the ecological status now? Measuring it against well-known metrics that we're all doing for inverts and the biological quality elements. And then what we need to do is actually look at the water body and regional policy goals, water body specific objectives and water quality. So this is where we want to be. This is what we want to achieve. And in general, this regional policy objectives tend to be the Water Framework Directive driven or Habitats Directive driven stuff, and the position within river basin management plans. Here, the water body goals, you have many flood directives and renewable energy directives. So there are many other things that we've got to do with that water body, not just achieve water a good ecological status or potential. So here we are. We now know where we are. So we know the status and we know where we want to go. So how do we go from there to there? And that's the fundamental question and answer that will come in the project formulation. We are comparing the status with the objectives. And this tells us what we've got to try and achieve. So you're beginning to set yourself some sort of objectives and some sort of endpoints that you're trying to target. Then you identify what the problem is from me getting here to here. How do you achieve it? So what's constraining us from going from A to B? And this is actually identifying the issues. So this is the pressures acting on it and the impact, the potential impact. You look at that and try and dissect it and understand it, and that's what we've got to address. And that's therefore reviewing the restoration measures. So this is our response. What measures are there? Which ones are the best measures? And we've got to look at what's appropriate, what can we actually achieve, and also we've got to be able to select the best measures for the appropriate scenarios. And that's not easy. And that's a whole process that I think most of us are looking for. Whether we can achieve it or not is another thing. But we've got to put in cost elements in there, and we've got to put in more than just ecological objectives, because there are social objectives, and there are all sorts of other constraints acting on us, such as archaeology of your systems. I mean, we have many weirs that we want to knock down. We're not allowed to touch them because they're archaeological heritage. And then we can actually look at these and we can review them, and the realism is that we then need to prioritise the process, the restoration. Which one's the best to give us the best outcomes for the least cost quite often? Or are there multiple wins that you can get from actually one restoration measure? And we need some mechanism for actually doing that. And finally, we need to follow and monitor it, and this is using classical monitoring processes, which I'm not going to deal with. But bear in mind that things can go wrong, and we need to put some sort of risk on this, the risk of getting it right or wrong, including uncertainties of our ability to say, yes, this will happen or not. And so there's a whole element of risk analysis that we will bring out through reform in the coming years. Just one. Now this looks complex. I'll just go through it. It's just another classic management tool called problem analysis or problem trees, to have a look at some mechanisms by which you can actually address your problems. And I've used this one, straight in disconnection of floodplains, because it's here. And actually, if you think about what's going on in reality, we have got straightened and disconnected our floodplains in many parts of the world. And the Dutch are actually probably the best at putting it right. But this is actually looking at the cause down here, and where it's coming from and what's driving the cause, so urbanisation, agriculture, flood alleviation, all those sorts of things, which will simplify the morphology, alter the hydrology, and the ultimate effects up here is that you'll get decreased heterogeneity of habitat and loss of species and all sorts of things, and the system collapses. And you can even look at what the result of that will be, that leisure activities are lost because your fish are lost, and you get erosion of all sorts of potential outcomes. This is a great way of actually looking at the cause and the effect. You can actually turn that, as I'll show you, into your options analysis and to what's possible. So what we've got to do is turn this into the programs and measures. And so what is the way forward? How do we do that? How do we take those sorts of examples and move them forward? And what we need to do is actually go and have a look at our objectives and what are we trying to achieve and what measures will overcome those problems that you've identified. And you can do a problem tree, fairly straightforward to do for each of the big issues that's going on your water body. And we need to define some sort of benchmarking or set some benchmarks. What do we want to get to define the objectives? And then we need something that's going to be very easy and practical and measurable associated with this benchmarking, so we can actually test whether it's worked. And finally, we have to put in this social economic coupling and framework, because we can't forget it, and unfortunately we tend to. Setting benchmarks, there's all sorts of possible ways. Everybody wants to go back to restoration, to the original state. Well, that's never going to happen. So we've actually got to start to look at where we are. And here's your ecological status versus the anthropogenic activities. And we've got to find some sort of common ground where we can all work towards. And generally, you can go to pristine, which is not going to be possible, or go somewhere, the best you can find is what you want to try and achieve, but we're somewhere sitting in the middle of it here. I would call it gardening personally, but it's cultural landscaping, something that is aesthetically acceptable to all of us. And that's where we're tending to move towards. And you want to make it as close to what the natural processes are, because you want to try and restore those natural processes. And one of the ways of actually then defining what you're going to do is use a deficit analysis or gap analysis. And because I'm going to be running out of time, I suspect, very quickly. With this deficit and gap analysis, we need to identify what they are. So we're looking at what's missing from our system. So like connectivity, we need some sort of fish passes and that type of process. So the benchmarking is actually trying to fill these gaps. I'm going to rush over that. And here is the similar sort of thing I've just shown you, but this is the almost the solutions tree, the objectives tree. We want to reconnect and remand and reconnect the floodplain. And the ways of doing it are pushing back levees, the sort of processes and the measures that we actually take, and these will be the outcomes. So you can actually look at the measures against the outcomes, and it'll help you start to decide which is the most appropriate measure to achieve certain targets. And these are some of the endpoint criteria you've actually got from the various life projects, which I think are very non-quantitative. So you've actually got riparian zone improvement. What does that mean? Flow dynamics improvement. What does that mean? They're non-quantitative. And so we need to go a bit more quantitative orientated, and we try to do that with a table which will be available on the website, the Reform website, which is actually looking at the options, the different measures, having a look at what they're trying to achieve, and having a look at the constraints. I can't show that any more than that, I'm afraid, because it's quite complicated. And finally, because I'm running out of time, I'll just talk about this, the Kissimmee river restoration from the United States, because this is probably the best example going. This is a huge multi-million-dollar project, and we're talking about millions of dollars here. They're actually for reinstating one of the big wetlands of Florida. And what they've actually done is broken their expectations down into biotic and abiotic responses. So they're looking at the criteria that they want to get. They want to improve channel velocities, river channel bed deposits and all sorts. They've got expectations associated with the plants and communities and floodplains, invertebrates, amphibians and fish. They've actually got defined criteria. These are fairly loose at the time in terms of quantitative, but they go on to actually make it more quantitative by actually having a standard format of outputs dealing with the expectation, and then they've got the metrics you're measuring and also the quantitative outputs of what they're trying to achieve and the way they're going to evaluate it, which is fundamental. And they capture risk in it, they capture social ecological coupling, and they look at the time frame. And the basic expectations here are, these are much more specific now for each of those. So they're linked to time frames, improving flows by certain criteria, changing fluctuations is in good old English metric systems, but that doesn't matter. I think you can translate that into about a metre. And they've got various actual changes. So they're proportional. They've actually got measured changes, quantitative, increasing, decreasing by certain proportions. And so it's important that we actually start to go along that line. And finally, I will finish here because I've only got 1 minute. We need to, once you've implemented it, we need to feedback. We need to put the system back in so we know what's good, what's bad, and what mistakes we've actually made. And what is very important is those projects that go wrong, let's report them. I'm convinced that there are more than 3 or 4 failed projects in all those life ones. I know there are. But, of course, you can't tell the European Commission that, can you? Okay, so that's where we are. I won't talk about synergies. I'll skip that bit. But we've got to, just to finish off, we need to engage with the other sectors, hydropower, navigation, and all those other sectors, so that we can actually get win-win scenarios out of our restoration, because they can actually provide a lot of the money and the provision for actually paying for this restoration measures. Because they seem to have money, and flood people tend to be the biggest ones. In fact, 2 days ago I was talking to a flood risk guy, and he said, we've got loads of money, but we don't know how to spend it. It didn't come to me. Okay, thank you.